Hi, thanks for watching. My name's Ian, I'm an advanced rider with West Yorkshire Advanced Motorcyclists, and I'm going to talk about pre-ride checks today. If you want to know more about what WYAMS does as a group, then visit wyam.org.uk, that's wyam.org.uk, and you can see more about what we do. So how do you do pre-ride checks? What I'm going to do is talk through a system that the Institute of Advanced Motorists advocate called POWDERY, which is a list of letters designed to help you remember what checks you should do on your bike, ideally before you ride it, but realistically on a regular basis. It doesn't matter whether you follow Powdery as such or a couple of other systems that I'll talk about later. What's most important is you do check the bike before you ride it, and you don't just get on assuming everything's going to be okay. There's some great reading in this book here. The police, not surprisingly, take this sort of thing very seriously. They've got a full checklist for you as an individual before you get on the bike, and they have a full checklist about checking over the bike, which they talk about as POWDERY-SS. POWDERY-SS. None of those letters will mean anything, so let's talk about them now. P is for petrol, O is for oil, W is for water, D is for damage, or drive if we copy from the police system. E is electrics, R is rubber, and Y is for you and your gear. Are you safe to ride the bike, and is your gear right for the ride you're about to make? There's also some useful reading to be had in the IAM course handbook if that's the course that you choose to do. WYAMS would help you do that. If you're interested, look us up online. Believe it or not, the Highway Code has actually got some pretty useful stuff on maintenance. It doesn't talk about checks per se, but it does have the information on tread depth and other factors that you should be considering when you're looking after the bike. Pre-ride checks start as soon as we get to the bike, before getting on, before moving the bike. It's worth just doing a once over and not doing Powdery in detail at this point. I'm going to do that in a moment, but just looking at the bike and starting at the top and working down towards the ground. I scan it and check to see down each side whether or not there's anything that looks amiss, out of place. Are the mirrors, do they look like they've been bashed? If it's been parked up somewhere, that's very common. Is luggage properly secured? Does the floor have anything on it, you know, fluids, leaks? Do the tyres look inflated? Is there anything obvious, basically? And you'll be doing this already. Maybe without even thinking about it. Take the steering lock off, and that gives me the chance just to check that the steering is clear and free, and I can turn the ignition on, and that gives me a chance to check fuel. That's all just taken a moment, of course, and as I said earlier, I expect you're doing this already. Before we take the bike out, it's worth just making sure about tyre pressures. Clearly, I imagine you know exactly how to do it, so I'm not going to patronise and show you. But this bike does have electronic tyre pressures, but I'm keen to make sure I check manually, and that's what this table under the seat tells me. Clearly, the tyre pressures need to be set for the ride that you're about to make, whether you're on your own or with luggage, or perhaps you're carrying a pillion and luggage. And it does depend. Different bikes obviously have different setups. You'll know how it works for yours. Just before we take the bike out of the garage, a quick word on these electronic tags. My bike's got keyless ignition, which actually on balance is probably more of a pain than anything else, because the battery in here has to be just right for the bike to recognise the fob. Otherwise, not a lot happens. Worth just checking that you've got spare batteries with you, especially if you're going on a long trip. We need to take this chain and padlock off, obviously, otherwise we're not going anywhere. And that's the same if you use a disc lock. Easy to forget that, of course. Right, we're ready to take the bike outside now so we can do Powdery in detail. But before we do, it's worth mentioning where you do your pre-ride checks. That matters a lot. The bike needs to be vertical and it needs to be on a horizontal surface, because otherwise when you check the fluid levels, you'll get a misreading. So I've got the bike on the centre stand in here, and ideally you do your checks in the garage before you take the bike out. There isn't enough room in here, so I'm going to take it outside now so we can do powdery in detail and you can have a proper view. P is for petrol. That's pretty much the simplest one of all these checks. Ignition on this bike, and we check the fuel gauge, which is here, and it shows that the bike is pretty much full. Obviously, if you haven't got a fuel gauge, then you can check in the tank itself, or give the bike a bit of a shake and you can hear that there's fuel. If you've got a reserve tap, just worth making sure that it's not left open, otherwise you'll run out but thinking you've still got reserve. O is for oil and all lubricants associated with the bike. Let's do oil first though. It's worth having a torch, and on this bike we come down and we look at the sight glass down here and you can see it's 2/3 full. The bike's not at operating temperature though, and that's when we should check the oil, because oil takes up more space when it's hot. So it's worth doing that at the end of a ride rather than perhaps at the beginning. Other lubricants to think about, well, there's clutch fluid on this bike in here. There's no way of inspecting that without opening it. The front brake has a reservoir here, and we can see from the sight line that there's plenty of fluid in there. And the rear brake has a reservoir here. Worth checking over the brake lines, making sure that there's no damage or nicks, and that there isn't fluid leaking. That's easier to see when the bike's in the garage than when you're out here on the driveway. W, well, it's for water. Well, not really water, but coolant. If you've got an air-cooled bike, well, you don't need to worry too much about this. But if you've got a water-cooled bike like this one, then you need to check the reservoir, which is in here. And we can see the level with a torch just moving around. If you need to top it up, well, then it's worth knowing how to do that. On this bike, it's under this cover. D is for damage and drive. This is a really big topic, but damage is basically seeing if there's anything amiss with the bike. Has it been knocked over? Whether you've not been with the bike, maybe your front brake lever has been knocked off, or the clutch lever has been damaged, or perhaps if you've got panniers on, they've been driven into. Anyway, it's about walking around the bike and checking to see whether there are any issues with the bike. There aren't with this bike. It's all done. I cleaned it last night and I checked it over then, and that's not a bad way of doing it. D is for drive. On this bike it's pretty simple. We've got a shaft drive here, and all I'm looking for is to see whether or not the gate is intact, or whether there are any leaks which are stopping that being effective. If you've got a chain, obviously you've got to check the tension on the chain, check your sprockets, and make sure that the chain looks okay, the sprockets look okay, and there's nothing obviously amiss. Do the wheels run smoothly? That's a fair check to do. E is electrics. Well, there's loads of electrics on this bike, and other bikes are a hell of a lot simpler, and I do sometimes wonder whether that would be better. But what we're looking at on electrics is, are there any warning lights that are giving us concern? This ABS flashing light on my bike is there because the sensors haven't given any information to it, but that'll go off once we get going. We need to check the headlight. Are the indicators working, front and rear, both sides, front and rear? Is the backlight working? Are auxiliary lights that you have mounted? I've got some fog lights on the front. Do they work? Mine only work when we're driving, so you need the engine on to test those. Brake lights are not easy to check when you're on your own, but if you press the brake pedal and you hold your hand out like that, then you can usually see whether the brake light's operating. Same with the front lever, like that. Does the full beam work? Everything to do with the electrics, that's what you're thinking about. R for rubber. Well, the obvious rubber is the tyres. What do the tyres look like? Is there reasonable tread? Take out stones, of course, and just have a brief look and make sure that you're seeing what you expect. A minimum 1 millimetre tread depth across 3/4 of the tyre is the legal minimum, but this one's pretty new, so it's in good nick. The front tyre, we clearly check the front tyre. I push the bike back a bit and give it a bit of a going, and it's looking fine. But other bits of rubber that are easy to forget: your grips. Do they feel all right? Is anything hanging off? And does your throttle operate smoothly? It's worth checking that now. If you have rubbers on your pedals, I don't on this bike, apart from the gear lever, but if that rubber's hanging off, you could catch your foot and slip, and it might give you a problem. Which leaves us with Y, which stands for you and your gear. And that's all about, are you ready to make the ride? Are you in the right frame of mind? Have you got alcohol in your system? Are you going to have a good ride, basically? And have you got the right gear with you? So that's Powdery. Now, the police add 2 letters to Powdery. They add S and S. S for steering. Does the steering move freely lock to lock? And is there anything that you can see which would impede the movement of the handlebars while you're on the road? And S for suspension. Does the suspension damp the way you expect and rebound? That's quite hard holding this camera. And have you got the suspension adjusted for the ride that you're about to do? I've put the bike on the side stand now, and before you set off, it's worth making sure that the centre stand, if you have one, is fully retracted. And on the side stand, there'll be a side stand cutout when it's down that stops the engine from running, and that's an MOT thing to check. So that's not an everyday thing, but it's definitely worth keeping an eye on and making sure that it works. If it breaks while you're out, then it's a complete pain. So it is worth keeping an eye on. So let's summarise what we've talked about today. P, petrol. O, oil stroke lubes. W, water stroke coolant. D is damage or drive. E, electrics. R, rubber, including the grips. And Y is you and your gear. And if you want to do a complete job like the police, then we add in S for steering and S for suspension. Well, we're ready to go now, and I guess that most people won't do all of those checks every day, but hopefully I've given you a bit of an idea as to how to do regular checks as and when you choose to do them. But once you're ready to start, clearly on with the ignition. Check the bike's in neutral. Mine doesn't start in first. In with the clutch to protect against false neutrals. At that point we can check auxiliary lights, for example. I'm just pointing at the wall so I can see that they're operating satisfactorily, and we can check full beam and flasher, what about the horn as well? But make sure you're not operating the horn when you're not supposed to, as per the highway code. Once we're on the move, then it's time to do a rolling brake test. Not an emergency stop, but just to check that the brakes aren't pulling left or right, they're doing what you expect. And then you can get settled into your ride, confident that the bike and you are ready to go.